All right, so I just ask everybody to put themselves on mute while our speaker is doing her presentation, and then after the presentation we will have time for Q&A. So
be on mute.
Guy, can you put yourself on mute? Yeah, there we go. Okay. And so today we are very lucky to have Miss Diane Dolan. She is the Government Affairs Manager in the administration. She worked with Councilor Benton and I on this short-term rental ordinance update that we proposed and of course, as you all know, failed. But she did a great deal of research on the short-term rental market in Albuquerque and in other cities across the country. And so we just asked her to come and give you an overview of what happened, what's happening with short-term rentals. So I'm going to turn it over to her, give her time to do her update for us. And then, like I said, after she's finished, we will do Q&A. So thank you for being here today, Diane. Go ahead.
Thank you, Councilor. Hi, everybody. As she mentioned, my name is Diane Dolan. I'm the Government Affairs Manager for the Mayor. So my focus is on council and the work they're doing, and also shepherding the Mayor's policy priorities through the council process. So early this year, the Mayor proposed, as part of the Housing Forward strategy, some restrictions on short-term rentals in Albuquerque. So this was one piece of a bigger strategy. I know a lot of you are familiar with the changes to the IDO, et cetera. But in looking into the issue of short-term rentals in Albuquerque, as in much of the country, the numbers have been proliferating. And when we are in a housing crisis, losing 1,200 housing units to the short-term rental market that could otherwise be housing Albuquerque families is a concern. And when the city is putting a lot of money into developing affordable housing, to be losing at the same time a number of housing units that exceeds our investment, even in new housing, it's sort of at odds with the intent of addressing our housing unit. So when we started looking at this legislation last fall, in September of 2022, the city had 1,061 short-term rental units listed. Not all of those were permitted. We do have an existing short-term rental ordinance that requires, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the existing regulations, but it does require that these listings be permitted with the city. 1,200 is about average over going all the way back to 2019. The market fluctuates, but we generally had been around 1,200 units. When we first proposed the legislation, we proposed a cap on short-term rental units of 1,200. Again, at the time, we were looking at a little over 1,000. That allowed for a little bit of growth, but said, you know, after this point, we're going to cap it. We can't keep losing housing to this industry. By the time that bill was introduced and referred to committee, that number in February of 2023 had ballooned to 1,434 short-term rentals in the city. With about half of them being, or actually only about 40% of them being permitted. So that within 4 months, we saw a loss of 400 housing units that are no longer available for Albuquerque families to live in, that went to the short-term rental market. And while the industry liked to focus on the percentage of the housing market, I don't think that gives a really honest picture of the impact. So maybe that is only 0.5% or 1% of our total housing stock. But if you look at the cost to replace those units, it's astronomical. 400 units, if we were to attempt to replace those simply with converted motel or hotel rooms, that's a very low cost way to create new housing units. We're looking at $40 million. And the units we were losing were not single occupancy, for one or two people. A lot of them are single family homes. So we're really looking at a cost of about $100 million just to replace those 400 homes that were lost between September of last year and February of this year. So our approach focused on two things. Number one, controlling the growth and setting a cap, a limit that says, okay, we recognize the contributions of this industry, but there comes a point where the proliferation, the negative impacts start to outweigh the potential economic benefits. So our original bill that Councilor Fiebelkorn and Councilor Benton sponsored did a few things. It required a local manager. And one of the reasons that we were doing that is to sort of discourage out-of-town corporations and companies from buying up large numbers of housing stock here and running Airbnbs from California or Michigan, wherever they were at, and to keep the focus on local ownership and management. The other thing that we did was limit the permit. We proposed to limit the permits to natural persons. So while an owner, so for example, some of the even smaller owners here in Albuquerque, if they own 3 units, they might own that property in the name of an LLC. And that would still be allowed, but their permit would have to be issued to an actual person and not to an LLC. The intent behind this was also to sort of restrict corporations and LLCs and larger companies from buying up a lot of properties and, permitting hundreds of them, because they would have to have an individual who was holding each of those permits. We also proposed to cap the numbers of individual permits. So an individual would only be able to have up to 3 permits. Right now, there's no restriction on the number of permits that any individual or any entity can have in the city. So those were the 3 main ways, the 3 main proposals of the original legislation. As I mentioned, by the time this got to committee, that number had gone up. So 1,200 was less than the number that currently existed. It was still more, I would like to note, and I know that this was an important point for Councilor Fiebelkorn, this was still more than the number that were permitted, because we still don't have 100% compliance. We're up to about 60. So we were at 40 at the beginning of the year. We're up to about 60% compliance. But even in February, there was only 607 that were permitted. We knew there were 1,434 short-term rentals, but only 600 of those were permitted. So, however, in speaking with industry folks and other counselors and hearing their concerns, there were some amendments at the Finance Committee. An amendment was passed to increase that cap from 1,200 to 1,800. There was an amendment passed that would exempt single rooms within an occupied property. So if you want to rent out a room in your house on Airbnb, you could do so. You'd still have to get permitted. You'd still have to follow all the other requirements, but your permit wouldn't count against that cap, because it's, again, our goal was to preserve housing stock. And if you are living there renting out a room, that doesn't impact the housing stock. We also, we also created a legacy exemption for people who currently have more than 3 permits, that they would be able to renew those permits in perpetuity as long as they kept them current and otherwise complied with the ordinance, so that anybody who was currently had a business model and they had 10, short-term rentals, we weren't impacting them by reducing that number to 3. But going forward, for new permits, nobody would be allowed to get more than 3 permits. At City Council, there was still a lot of pushback, even with the compromises that had been passed at committee and others that had been in discussion. So the sponsors had a floor substitute. We worked with them on this. We were very open to, again, making more compromises so that we could get something passed here. So what was proposed at the last council meeting was a floor substitute that would have sort of scrapped all of those proposals I just told you and taken a different approach. And that would be to, instead of limiting the number of permits, there was really adamant resistance to that. Even if we set the number at 3,000, we were being told we still won't support it. We will never support a cap on the number of permits. So we took a new approach, and it was to, instead of capping the number with a specific number, we sought to restrict the number through a distance separation requirement, where no permit would be issued for a short-term rental that was within 300 feet in any direction, which is about a city block, of another short-term rental. This approach actually had an added benefit of keeping concentrations from occurring in specific areas. So it wasn't just a citywide cap, but this says basically one per block. We do know that the negative impacts of short-term rentals increase with increased concentration in a given area. Having some here and there is not, and I probably don't have to tell you this as neighbors, is not the same as having 5 houses on your street that are short-term rentals. We had anticipated that with that floor substitute, the bill would need to be deferred because council has a rule that you can't vote on a floor substitute the same night that it's approved. And there's also state requirements for advertising the title for 14 days before council could act. It was, quite frankly, very unusual that the floor substitute was not approved. That's generally sort of just a procedural, and the floor substitute, proposed substitute almost always is approved for the discussion. It's at least brought to the floor for the discussion. And in this case, council did have public comment and debate amongst themselves before they actually voted on the floor substitute. The floor substitute failed, and then subsequently they went ahead and voted on the bill itself, and that failed as well. I do want to add, there was one other amendment that was going to be proposed to that bill, again, with the intent of exempting people who are not using a home year-round as a short-term rental. So we heard from a lot of folks that, hey, I leave town, or my parents come stay with me during Balloon Fiesta, and they Airbnb their house during Balloon Fiesta. That's the only time of year they do it. It's otherwise their primary residence. We'd like for people to be able to make that extra bit of money. It's not taking a housing unit off the market, and it also helps people to stay in their homes in some cases. That was the logic behind exempting primary residences and single rooms. We didn't even have the opportunity to talk about that exception, that amendment, because the floor substitute failed. So where we are at right now is the most recent numbers that we have for, I just realized I don't have the most recent numbers on this list. I have July numbers. We're back down in July. I do have August, but I have them somewhere else. In July, we were back down to 1,255 units. Our compliance is up to 60%. The August number is actually a little bit lower than that again. So, you know, as I said, it's fluctuated over the years. It goes up and down, but in a housing crisis, we really just cannot afford to be losing this much housing stock to the short-term rental market. One other distinction with this is these regulations apply only to rentals for 29 days or less. So we recognize that there is a market and a demand for shorter term leases, midterm rentals, where for traveling nurses, for film industry folks. So, but those are typically month to month or maybe a 3-month rental. These regulations would not have impacted that. That's still housing. This is just more for the, the sort of the tourism type stays, the 1 week, the weekend stays, etc. I think I covered. So where we're at, to be clear, where we're at right now, we don't have any restrictions on short-term rentals. That bill failed 3-6. The sponsors and Councilor Davis were the 3 councilors who supported these restrictions. And then the other 6 councilors voted against them. There was some discussion about well, I don't want to rehash the entire debate. If you're interested, all of the council meetings are available online at Legistar. You can watch the video. It was quite a long discussion, but that's a summary of what was proposed and what happened with it. Councilor, I don't know if there's anything else specifically you'd like me to touch on before we go to questions.
I think that was a pretty good summary. And I'm glad you didn't go through all of the discussion again. Give me PTSD, I think. But I'll just say before we go to questions that, this was another one of those losses that's just kind of mind-boggling to me. These proposals on housing that I do are not crazy. They are not, something that no one's ever done. They're not unheard of. They're not some crazy new idea. These are things that are done all kinds of other places. And for some reason, we can't get the support to do them here in Albuquerque, and people are hurting. People can't find homes. I had 3 emails yesterday from somebody from 3 different people who can't find a place to live, and 1 email from someone who's being priced out of their existing home. We have a problem, and even something as simple as what Diane just described doesn't pass here. So you might be able to tell I'm a little frustrated, but we will open up for Q&A with Diane. I'll jump in if there's something that, I can help on, but go ahead and raise your hand or type it into the chat, and we'll ask Justin to monitor the chat and let us know if there's anything there. Any questions or comments?
Real quick, Councilor, I thank you for mentioning that about these were reasonable. We did a lot of research on what other cities are doing across the country and other states are doing. And we actually had Professor Krebs at UNM do an analysis and a white paper as well. And what we were proposing was fairly mild, actually, compared with what a lot of other cities were doing. There was nothing that we proposed that other places aren't doing and that isn't pretty standard. But as Councilor mentioned, for some reason, we couldn't even get that through.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. Bob.
Hey, thanks, Diane. It's a great summary. So what's at the root of the opposition? Is it just I won't speculate because I have bad ideas. But yeah, what are the arguments against this?
I'll let Diane go into the details, but I'll just say the opposition is what it's been on every one of these bills. We don't like regulation, and we have enough political power to stop it, and we will. But Diane, do you want to go through some of the actual, because that's, we listen to their concerns, we make an amendment, we try to work with it, and then that's not right either. So Diane, do you want to go through a couple of those? So
in general, the underlying argument is we don't like regulation. Some of the more specific arguments is that this is, an industry that contributes to the economy. So any regulation would hurt the economy, which doesn't necessarily recognize that we would still have tourists coming to Albuquerque. There would still be Airbnbs. There's also hotels that can accommodate those. So it was that it will hurt the economy, and that we are hurting entrepreneurs in Albuquerque who have a business model centered on having a large number of short-term rentals and managing those. Those were the two. That was the main argument against it. And then there was also a bit of people should be able to do what they want with their property.
Thank you.
Which I like to respond, unless you want to build an accessory dwelling unit or make it into a duplex, and then you can't do what you should be able to do with your property. All right, Cheryl.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Go ahead.
Oh, good, good. So yeah, on this housing thing, yeah, I wish I was better educated on it. Am aware that there is a horrible problem. And one of the things that occurs to me is that people raise their rents, quote, because they can, close quote. So for instance, I know a young man who had the wherewithal and the means to buy an extra home that he rents. He purchased it down near the UNMH area, and he rents it for $3,000 a month because he can. He rents it to traveling nurses because they have an allowance of up to $3,000 a month for rentals. So even though his mortgage payment is much less than that, he chooses to rent it for that amount because he can. So this type of attitude of raising rents uncontrollably because, quote, the market will bear it, or because they can, because it's allowed, or other rental units are charging that amount, so I'm going to too. This is adding to our problem, it seems to me. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. I mean, I agree. I will remind everyone that last year I had another ill-fated bill that just said it was a memorial asking the state to consider getting rid of the state prohibition on rent control. And that memorial went down in flames with literally 2 votes for it. So I completely agree. I think that it's not just at the city level. At the state level as well, there is a massive industry presence that stops any of these things from going through, period. Oh, I know, y'all. I know there's more questions than this.
May I ask a question again?
Of course.
Do some of the official industry bodies have stances on this? For example, the New Mexico Realtors Association, have they taken a stand on this one way or another?
On the short-term rental ordinance?
Yes.
So no, we didn't have anybody's take an official stance. I will say the short-term rental industry is not particularly well organized in a formal way. So they don't have an official association or lobby team. But I met with, we had Charlotte Parsons was assisting the administration in a lot of these housing forward efforts, and particularly assisting with outreach and getting us connected for input with some of these industries and the public in general. So Charlotte helped set up a total of 4 between the bill's introduction and the final vote at council on the 21st. Set up meetings for me with folks in the short-term rental business. Those meetings were attended by between 35 and 70 people over the course of those 4 meetings. So they showed up for the meetings. They're not necessarily formally organized, but they did show up. They do not necessarily speak with with one voice, but in general, they were all very opposed to what we were proposing. I will say that the folks that showed up are the ones that are using this as a business model. This was not mom and pop, we always hear, who have one extra property that they rent out or that are doing their own house. These were not people with one short-term rental unit. These were people that have made a business out of this. So I think even from the industry, the input that we got was skewed towards those who have used this as a business model. We did hear from the Greater Albuquerque lodgers and innkeepers. I think I might be using the wrong name for them, but we did hear from that association. They were not surprisingly supportive of the regulations, and they're not opposed. I want to be clear about that. They are not opposed to short-term rentals either, but they were certainly supportive of some regulation. They have to comply with a lot themselves as hotels, businesses. So we heard from them and they were supportive. But outside of that, there were no formal organizations that really weighed in on it.
You may have already covered this, Diane. Just what percentage of the short-term housing is owned by out-of-state interests or non-local interests?
So that's actually interesting. In Albuquerque, that's not a large number from what we can tell. The problem is that we have reliable data on only about 60% of those owners. Those are the ones that have complied and permitted their properties. Even then, the permit can be issued to somebody other than the owner. So it's sometimes difficult to tell, how many that a single owner owns. But based on that data, with the ones that are not registered, we have to look at the owners of records to find that information. And when I did an analysis of that, it looks like Albuquerque actually, that's not a huge problem for us yet. That most of our ownership is people who are local, but we are seeing throughout the country that it's becoming more and more common for out-of-state interests to be getting into this industry.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Diane, one thing that I found interesting was the response from Airbnb itself. Would you mind giving us a little overview of that, and then we will go to Lori?
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. So I also had a couple of meetings with corporate Airbnb. They now have a government affairs team or policy team that is being proactive actually about reaching out with cities around the country to work on regulations. They support regulations of short-term rentals. They specifically supported caps, individual caps, where owners could only have a certain number. They are very much coming from the position of what Airbnb started as was sharing economy. So their requests were specific to exempting those primary residences, or, and that includes whether you're renting a single room or you're only renting out your house, when you go on summer vacation or something like that. So they were supportive of those limits. Not surprisingly, they were not supportive of the overall cap. But they were also willing to work with us to a much greater extent than the local industry folks were. And they were willing, had they had the opportunity, to support a bill that included those exemptions for primary residences. But Airbnb itself is not, I know early on they were pushing back a lot against regulation, but they've gotten to a point, quite frankly, where it benefits them to have some market certainty, and they get that through regulation. So if this is something that at some point we decide we want to try to tackle again, we would be working with Airbnb again and hopefully getting their support on what we propose. But our local, to be clear, our local owners are pretty much unanimously opposed to regulation. They're opposed to the regulations they already have, and quite frankly, they're opposed to meeting requirements that any other business in Albuquerque. They don't think they should have to get a business permit for every location. I mean, they've really fought to be acknowledged as a legitimate industry, yet at the same time have opposed any regulations that any other industry in the city have to comply with. So it's an interesting group.
We'll hate being told what to do.
Yeah, that's true. Lori, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, because I can't find the hand thing. I don't do Zoom as much as I used to. So am I correct that when somebody registers through the current regulations as a short-term rental, that they have to pay some kind of lodger's tax?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And
so maybe that's one of the reasons that they're already paying Airbnb or whatever.
They're paying the lodger's tax even if they're not registered, because we have an agreement with Airbnb, and Airbnb collects that lodger's tax from So if, now that's only Airbnb. So if they're in VRBO, and there's one other. So the three main platforms, we have agreements with them where the marketplace provider, which is Airbnb, collects that lodgers and hospitality tax for us and pays for them and pays the city. So whether or not they're actually have a permit with us, they're still paying us those taxes.
Well, I have a neighbor who has a number of these. She moved out of her house here in my neighborhood and turned it into one. And she told me she has several, they're all registered, and she mentioned that tax. So maybe it's, but she said she's registered with the city. And then when can you introduce this again? I mean, this isn't just down in flames, right? Some regulations or something?
I'll jump in, Diane. There's no point of reintroducing it at this point. I mean, we had 3 votes and we've worked on it for months and months and months. I also can't legally introduce the same legislation within the same council. We will have a new council technically on January 1st. And it really depends on the results of that election of whether we will pick up any votes on this or anything else. So, you know, technically we could do it again in January, but if I don't have the votes, I don't think we want to put Diane through that again because it was a lot of work for her. I don't see more hands up. Justin, do we have anything in the chat?
We do, a couple questions.
Okay.
So first question from Jack. What do you think would be the best means at a community level to counterbalance the amount of industry influence on decisions like these?
Diane, do you want to go and then I'll go?
Sure, I'll take a step. Showing up at council meetings, writing to the city council. They heard very loud and clearly from industry folks. They didn't hear as much from their constituents in, neighborhood folks. I recognize the industry folks are somebody's constituents too, but they weren't hearing from the neighborhoods. So I think it would have I don't know that it would have necessarily changed the outcome completely. I think it might have, it potentially could have changed at least a couple of votes, but they weren't hearing from neighborhoods. And we hear a lot of counselors, regardless of what the issue is, when they're hearing from folks, you will hear them say on the dais, we should be listening to the neighborhoods. And just for whatever reason, I don't know if we weren't getting the word out as good. We were trying to, we were using the same lists that we had used for the IDO Housing Forward updates. But for whatever reason, folks just didn't reach out to counselors or show up at council meetings to tell them why they might think it's important for us to have these restrictions. I think that's the main thing is talk to your counselor.
And
I'm going to say that not all city councilors are responsive to neighborhoods like Tammy is. So
absolutely true.
All the same.
I appreciate that, Lori, but I do think that there are 2 counselors that continually say we should listen to neighborhoods and vote the way that neighborhoods ask them to. And neither of them voted for this bill, which means in my mind that they were not approached by their neighborhoods. And
I'm not in their district.
Yeah, I know.
They don't listen to me. They don't listen to me.
I realize most of the folks on this Zoom are in my district, so of course, you have an avenue, but I will say, take a look at the video from the meeting where this floor sub was voted down and then the bill was voted down. It was very unbalanced, the numbers of people speaking against and for. There were like 2 that were speaking for, but a large number speaking against, and that is problematic. And I'm like Diane, I'm not sure we've gotten enough to actually pass the bill, but we might have picked up 1, potentially 2 more votes, and that would have 2 would have been what we needed. So really getting involved is in my mind the answer.
Well, and there's no reason not to write to every city councilor. I write to all the county commissioners, and I have written to all city councilors. I don't know if it has any influence or not, but there are definitely some city councilors who don't like the power that neighborhoods can hold.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
and I
just
would say, in addition to writing, I agree that that's huge. But I believe that the most impactful thing you can do beyond showing up at council, either via on Zoom or in person, is to call policy analysts from every single city councilor and tell them how you feel. So, let's finish the chat. I don't know if we got through with that, Justin, and then we'll go to John.
Yeah, so just a comment from Jean. If you think there is a housing crisis now, incorporate rent control. A number of places with rent control have no new construction. Also, maintenance tends to degrade in locations with rent control.
Thanks, Jean. I will say, you know, as an example, New York City has had rent control since 1970, and there is a lot of construction happening there. But I don't think anyone in Albuquerque was proposing the old school rent control, which is, you know, we're going to have this same rent for the next 50 years. But what we did here suggested, and something that we could have considered if we were able to get the state law changed, is something along the lines of what Cheryl was talking about. You know, we have rents, you move in, and then there can be a limit on how much it can increase per year. You know, 15% increase per year could be something that we could consider. There are suggestions then we could have looked through doing it only for existing buildings so that new buildings were still incentivized to be built. There's a lot of ways around that to really address those kinds of concerns. But again, we can't do anything about that in Albuquerque. It's literally illegal unless the state law changes. Okay, Justin, back to you. Is there anything else?
Yeah, just two more. So one from Susan says, is Airbnb willing to work directly with property renters?
Diane?
Well, I think they would be. I don't know that they would be any more successful than we've been. I think unless Airbnb is willing to implement some of these policies and limitations themselves, they, you know, like I said, they were on a different page from our local owners, and I certainly wanted the opportunity to have Airbnb weigh in, but the way the meeting went on the 21st was, like I said, not what we were anticipating. We thought that we would have one more meeting for that, but they're not on the same. They don't have the same position as our local owners. And I think it would have been good to have them weigh in, but I also believe that some of the counselors that opposed this, because of what they were hearing from industry folks, would have weighed the input of local owners greater than the input of the corporation. Quite, you know, that was sort of my take, but they're willing to work with them. I don't think our local owners are willing to work with Airbnb on that unless they're forced to.
Thanks, Diane. Oh, yeah. Sorry, is there one more?
Yeah, there's at least one more. So from Michelle, do Airbnbs pay gross receipts taxes? What's the penalty for being non-registered?
So they do pay the lodger's tax. Technically, they should be paying gross receipts tax. They should have a CRF number, and should be paying. Actually, let me check myself on that. I do not know the exact answer to that, and I don't want to misspeak. So let me look into that and double check. I think they are supposed to be paying gross receipts tax, but I'm going to make a note and I will follow up. I'll send an answer to Justin and Councilor Fiebelkorn that they can pass on to you, but I don't want to misspeak. So gross receipts tax, and the penalty is, so the penalties of violating the ordinance, whether it's the permit requirement or any of the other requirements, are the general penalties provisions of our code of ordinances, which are criminal penalties, and they are up to $500 or up to 90 days in jail for each violation. And the violation is technically a per diem violation, so that could add up. We also have a provision for a civil penalty of a fine of up to $500, but the ordinance as it exists today requires that the city file a civil suit in order to collect that penalty. So one of the changes that we had proposed in the floor substitute helps the city with enforcement, but it was also something that we were sort of hoping would get some of the local owners to come to the table. And that was to add an administrative hearing provision so that the city, excuse me, does not have to take somebody to court to collect that civil penalty. We could just give a fine, and then there would be an internal city hearing process for them to appeal. But the penalties are loss of your permit, and also or the criminal penalties and or a civil penalty of up to $500.
And I, just to follow up, was that Michelle Metters, I think. So Michelle, I said this on the dais and maybe you heard it, but I will be pushing for actual enforcement now. We have not been pushing on enforcement. We've sent out some letters. We haven't really gone that route. But I for one will be pushing for full enforcement of the existing ordinance, because it is, in my mind, pretty darn shocking that we're up dramatically to 60% of owners that are actually registered. And that is, in my mind, ridiculous. So, okay, anything else in the chat? Because I want to get on to the last three folks that have their hands up.
Yeah, so he just responded in the chat. Have you lived anywhere with rent control?
I live in Albuquerque. So, John, let's go to you.
Thanks again for doing this. It's been pretty informative, I have to say. So it appears that the principal impetus for this and the rationale for putting this forward still is focused on trying to ensure that there's adequate housing, affordable housing for people, right? The reason for, I would say that secondarily, the reason is so there's no degradation of neighborhoods and living environment and such like that. But the principal reason is, if I understand correctly, is that there is a lack, or there's the desire to keep those homes that are currently dwellings for people to live in from being pulled off the market. In other words, exacerbating the problem of affordable housing to start with. Is that correct? Am I correct in that assumption?
I can speak for the administration, and I'll allow the counselor to speak for herself. That was for the mayor, that was the purpose, that was the impetus in proposing these regulations, correct?
And for myself, I think my point was that we need to maintain all existing housing stock. We have, just as much of an issue for accessibility to housing in high income, middle income, and low income families. So I wouldn't say it was specifically for affordable housing, but just housing stock in general.
So
yes, and I'm sorry, I should have made that distinction as well. The entire housing forward strategy is not specific to affordable housing, but we can increase affordable housing by increasing all and preserving all housing at all different levels.
So just a quick follow-up on when you first started, Diane, you mentioned about the cost, the analysis that was done to determine the cost of increasing the housing, increasing the number of homes that are available. And your numbers were fairly large. Can you kind of run through those? I hate to ask too many pointed questions, but I kind of, in context of what you've been talking about, it would be good to hear those numbers just succinctly again.
Okay, so I based my first numbers on the cost to the city to do a hotel motel conversion project. And I had that number handy because the city recently acquired a hotel and is in the process of converting it to apartments. So we had those numbers pretty handy. That's the very lowest end of the scale, and that's about $100,000 per unit. That's really, really low cost. And again, these are just single, maybe one or two people are going to live in each of these units. They're not suitable for a family of 4 or 5, et cetera. So the 400 units at a cost of $100,000 per unit works out to $40 million. Again, that's just for a very small housing unit. So if you look at the numbers of cost of new construction for a single family home, for example, you're looking closer to $200,000 for the cost of anywhere from 150 to 200. So that's where I get to and if you're talking about reselling existing properties, you know, you have other costs in there. So I was really just ballparking it. I don't want, you know, you to take those numbers for gospel. But so the $40 million for 400 units was based at the low end, was based on our actual cost for the conversion we're currently involved in. And then we know from there, it just increases and easily doubles if we're talking about units that are, you know, larger than a 1-bedroom or a studio. And I do have a meeting in 6 minutes, but I think we have one more question and I have time to take that.
Yeah, Cheryl.
Hi, yes, me again. A few things. Tammy, I really do appreciate you. I did oppose your point of view on the R1 zoning thing, and that was a little bit on the selfish side of me, and I admit that. But I do appreciate you, and I want to. And then you just mentioned that maybe we could tolerate a 15% annual increase on rent, and I just want to say, I cannot remember a time ever during my employment, the time when I was employed, now I'm retired, when I got annual raises of 15%. And so that would just be devastating to renters. I don't understand. Back in the day, remember back in the day when we were kids and people could have, you know, a dad could have a job and mom could stay home, or both mom and dad could work. I mean, and everything wasn't so much based on greed. It just seems to me like everybody is so greedy these days. I just don't understand, how can we combat this? How can we get back to some moral kind of compass? Okay, I think I'm done. But 15%, I mean, look, if milk increased by 15% and meat and eggs and rent and water and electricity, that's just crazy town. You can't do that. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. I agree. Diane, I saw you come off mute. I'm gonna let you close up because I do know that Diane has to get to her next meeting.
So thank you, everybody, for being here and your interest and your questions. I will get that white paper to Justin so he can forward it on to all of you. I'll also get an answer to the gross receipts question and make sure that it's accurate and send that. And also, I want to second the appreciation. I know the administration very much appreciates Councilor Fiebelkorn. Not every counselor is willing to fight these really hard fights and take these losses. And he's a champ. And so thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Diane. We really appreciate you being here. I know everybody's thankful, but it's just nice to have somebody that can come and present the information and share so much knowledge. So thank you. Thank you. Folks, you can stay on. We've got another 4 minutes, so I can answer any other questions. If anybody raises their hand, I'll call on you. So it's 10:57. Surely somebody has another question. And Justin, you can go ahead and stop recording too. Michelle.